Welcome back to SNC Tonight. Mark Davis. When we take a look at the various levels of American society that have been overtaken by wokeism, we know that the culture is going to be pulled in some direction or another by the American left. They control academia, they control the entertainment industry, they control certainly the dominant media culture. But what about charitable giving? There's an oddity that has reared its head of late, and that is the degree to which people funneling charitable giving. And obviously, charity is charity, right? And there may be liberal charities, conservative charities, some charities that are completely apolitical. But what if the United Way, and I've spent my life admiring the United Way. My mom worked for the United Way in the Washington, D.C. area, 30 years ago. So I've had no lifetime gripe with the United Way. But is nothing immune? It's a pleasure to welcome Mr. Norman Woods, who's the executive director of a group called Family Voice. And he's noticed some degrees to which the United Way is starting to inject some wokeism into the way that they direct charitable giving, something you would think would be free of such things. Mr. Woods, pleasure to have you. Tell us what you've noticed.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Mark. So yeah, I mean, conservatives, we've kind of come to expect that, hey, groups like Starbucks, they don't align with our values. We're starting to see woke things weave its way in. But surely the United Way, again, like you said, they've got a reputation. They just help people out. They give people a leg up. It's a charity group. Well, unfortunately, that's not always the case. Now, if you look back a couple years, even Rod Dreher wrote about this in the American Conservative. He had a reader reach out to him and say, here's what my husband was asked to do, and explained all the different reporting requirements that really were centered around diversity, equity, and inclusion, which we can talk about in a minute. But that's the new buzzword that conservatives need to know about. So a couple years ago, Rod Dreher writes about this nationally. And then a few months ago, a local friend reaches out to me and says, hey, this is what I'm noticing. And he unpacks everything that he's seen, because he's a local nonprofit that applies to United Way for funds. He says, hey, I'm really concerned about this. And he unpacks everything. And again, we know that words matter. For example, as the conservative movement, we know that the word tolerance, it doesn't mean what we all used to think it means. We know there's a huge agenda behind that word. We thought tolerance meant, hey, we're going to treat everybody nice. Well, the bakers and the florists and the football coaches that have been fired or gone to jail, that's not very nice. We know the agenda behind that buzzword. The new buzzword that conservatives need to know about is equity. And it has nothing to do with treating people nice or treating people equally, especially when it's paired with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's the new agenda that is really finding its way in United Way. So Rod Dreher's written about it, and we're locally as well.
Indeed, and it is often said, I don't know who coined this, that the first battle over everything is a battle over language and the hijacking of certain words. You're right, equity, somebody would hear equity and think, oh, surely it just means equality, being equally kind to people and having everyone treated the same. Not so much. Let's take a look at diversity. Diversity is wonderful in a country like America, where anybody can come here, no matter what their race, their creed, their national origin. We're a melting pot, all that, that's all great. But diversity in the hands of the left is a kind of a forced diversity that makes race the leading indicator of qualification rather than merit. And that, too, I assume you would view as a bit of societal poison.
Right. And again, it's all rooted, in Marxist ideology, because you can go back to see just that equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. They're two separate things. And as conservatives, we know that. And we can even, if we're talking about here like Marxism, ideologies, let's go back to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a name that conservatives should know, exile from Russia. He said that people are born with different capacities. If they're free, they're not equal. If they're equal, they're not free. So DEI is trying to, again, level the playing field, which, again, that's a socialist idea. So it's seeping its way into local United Ways.
And the third, the I of the DEI is inclusion, which again sounds wonderful. And again, in the dictionary, it is to be inclusive, to be welcoming. This is a noble trait. But what the left is trying to do with inclusion is making sure that people are forced into associations, into hiring, into, including men into women's locker rooms, the kind of inclusion that should never happen. Let me take the D, the E, and the I, put them all together. And with a group like Family Voice, do you feel like it's becoming harder to make these. I mean, 30 years ago, if this show exists 30 years ago, and somebody's watching this saying, wait a minute, what? That's not what diversity should mean. That's not what equity or equality should mean. That's certainly not what inclusiveness should mean. So what is it that leads us in 2023 to have these basic fights over these basic concepts?
I think it's old ideologies coming back. What is it? In the Bible, it says there's nothing new under the sun. It's just a rebranding of things we've seen before. And that's why quotes from Alexander Solzhenitsyn or examining Marxist ideology really matters, because it's just a recycling of the same ideas coming back in. And so, for example, in the local United Way, my friend Dan unpacked all the different requirements that he was going to be asked to meet. And they were being asked questions like, what are the different demographics that you're serving? And how many of them are you serving from this group and that group and the other group? And all these different questions. Again, when you pair it with the words like diversity, equity, and inclusion, knowing what that truly means, he could see exactly where this is going. You're going to base my funding based on whether or not I get in line with your Marxist ideology here. And they were like, well, no. We just want to know. We're just, asking these reporting questions.
Right.
But then in the breath, they say, we want to know for our next decisions. We're not going to base.
Sure, we're just asking. There's no agenda here. We just want to know. Speaking of agendas, having visited a number of times just in the last few minutes about Marxist ideology, is it hard to be optimistic? I always like to be optimistic, but is that a little harder when we know that the coming generation of college kids on probably most college campuses are simply being immersed and steeped in fresh doses of Marxist ideology? I just talked about 30 years ago. 30 years from now, I hope we have a country in which we can still fight this fight. It's a daunting prospect, the number of young people graduating from college right now who have exactly the wrong take on everything you and I are talking about.
It can be really discouraging. Honestly, I'm not throwing in the towel, because if we look culturally across the different generations, honestly, the younger generation was almost always essentially more liberal than their parents. So it's a trend that we've seen for decades and decades and generations. Now, is it a little worse off right now than it maybe was 30 years ago? It probably is, which means we just need to fight harder. I'm not ready to throw in the towel, and I don't think anybody else should either.
How much of it, in the last 60 seconds or so, how much of it is political? How much of it is societal? Obviously, we're bearing down on an incredibly important election year. Some of these problems get better by electing better people, and I think you and I would have a shared view on what kinds of people those are. How many of the solutions have nothing to do with politics at all? They're about us, our families, our churches, our communities.
I think it all boils down to that. I think there's some big political goals here that are pulling on people's heartstrings, which is, again, why they use nice words like D and E and I, diversity and equity. So they use nice words for their political goals, but we know it affects our families and we know it affects our communities. So people need to look up groups like Leninists on the Prairie. They're looking at here in South Dakota. Are there different woke groups that are taking those big political goals and bringing it down home to our families, to our communities, to our local charities? So it always boils down to the family and to down home.
Did you just literally say Leninists on the Prairie? That's a thing.
Prairie.
Perhaps that's a point on which to conclude, if only because I'm speechless. Oh, Mr. Woods, thanks for all the battles that you're fighting in that direction. We appreciate you, and thanks for being with us from Family Voice. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks for having me on, Mark.
Oh, goodness gracious me. All right. Well, speaking of things that are crazy, we're going to spend some focus in the next segment about Hamas and terror and Israel and just all that entire part of the world that's on fire. And it's easy to sit back and look at the TV box and say, well, that's just crazy. That's insane. We throw these words around a lot. And, conversationally, it's proper that we do. How can a human being who has the same type of human heart, the same type of human brain, we can have political disagreements. We can have disagreements like the Israelis might have with the Palestinians, but we can have global disagreements on all kinds of the parts of the world stage. What makes somebody decide, I'm going to get in a plane and fly it into the World Trade Center? That's going to be my statement. What makes somebody say, I feel the way I do about the Palestinian side of an argument versus Israel, so I'm going to help engineer, as Hamas has now done, an incursion across the border to slaughter all kinds of innocent people? What in the world makes somebody even do that? What kind of human being does that? There's all kinds of political analysis, cultural analysis. Maybe, though, if something really is crazy, what you need is a good psychiatrist. We found one. We'll talk to her next, and got a lot more to come on SNC tonight. I'm Mark Davis. Do stay with us. Much more to follow.